You know, the last 2 years have been incredibly stressful for her, just watching the maneuvering of the New York criminal trial and also watching, how aggressive Harvey Weinstein's defense was. But obviously it was a huge relief for her to see the jury convict him. Obviously it takes a lot of pressure off of her in the Los Angeles criminal case. But she's prepared to go, and she's going to see it through, and she's looking forward to her day in court. The aggressive defense in New York absolutely affected her because she's saying, okay, I'm next. And that's stressful for anyone, and especially when it's such a high-profile case. Everyone's following it, and I mean, let's face it, those lawyers went incredibly hard after those victims. But in the end, she saw that justice worked, the system worked, and she's prepared to go through the same thing those courageous victims in New York went through. Well, it gets complicated. Harvey Weinstein is going to be imprisoned in New York, and LA is going to have to make arrangements for him to either be transferred or extradited to Los Angeles for his arraignment. And that's where he shows up in court for the very first time, and the charges are read against him. And then he's probably transferred back to New York for a while. And once the criminal case in LA gets close, he'll be brought back to Los Angeles and imprisoned here while that criminal case takes place in Los Angeles. So it's going to be a lot of maneuvering. It's going to take time. It's not going to happen overnight. But hopefully the Los Angeles case, the trial starts, hopefully in a matter of months. The situation in New York was very unique. You had victims who had ongoing relationships with Weinstein. In Los Angeles, you're going to see an entirely different scenario. Jane Doe number one had no relationship whatsoever with Harvey Weinstein. She'd met him a couple of times. There's not a single email between them. There's not a single phone call between them. There's not a single text message between them. After he raped her, she never saw him again and never spoke to him again. So it's an entirely different scenario, and frankly, it's one that Weinstein's going to have a very, very, very difficult time overcoming. The conviction in New York is monumental because it absolutely gets introduced in the Los Angeles trial. Those jurors in Los Angeles, not only will they hear that Weinstein raped Jane Doe 1 and sexually assaulted Jane Doe 2, they're going to hear that he's been convicted of sexual assault and rape in New York. So those convictions will be admissible in Los Angeles. Obviously, a very, very powerful piece of evidence to add on to Weinstein's troubles here already.
Hey, NBC News viewers, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down here and click on any of the videos over here to watch the latest interviews, show highlights, and digital exclusives. Thanks for watching.